full house here anyway. So today we're talking about heritage neighborhoods. To start, well, just acknowledge the land traditions and culture of the four nations, the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Silks. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So this was one of those things where I could go on forever, but I'll try not to. There's close to 100 slides in here. It was really, wow. I spent 2 days adding slides and then another day taking slides out. So we'll start off with the Farwell Townsite. The Farwell Townsite was applied, this fellow, Albert Stanhope Farwell, who is a provincial surveyor, applied to the provincial government for a land grant here in 1883, and he was being quite cagey. He applied for his land grant just before the CPR filed their survey plan, and that survey plan, CPR's plan as part of the Railway Belt Act would have put all of this land under the control of the Dominion government, and in most cases directly being given to the CPR as a bonus for building the railway. It was a pretty huge bonus. But Farwell, being a surveyor and having been in this area since as early as the 1870s, knew exactly where the railway was going to cross, and he was trying to do an end run around the CPR, so he applied for the land grant here, knowing that this would be railway land. And but he thought because he was applying for it before the Railway Belt Act was in effect, because they hadn't sort of specifically said yet that this was the railway, this was on the railway line, he thought he could get around that. The provincial government, as far as they were concerned, the Railway Belt Act also wasn't in effect for this land because nothing had been filed with them. So as far as they were concerned, they had free right to assign this land to anybody that applied for it and paid their fees. So Farwell ended up with his town site here. This is the actual Farwell town site that was registered in 1885. And because his application had been approved before the Railway Belt was determined, he was given the land here, as well as his cute little town site. He was granted quite a bit of other land as well, which comprised most of what's now Columbia Park. But you can see here, there's the railway going through and crossing the Columbia River, and there's Front Street. So Front Street was the original main street of the Farwell town site. Most of you know the story of what happened. Farwell's idea was to sell some of his land to the railway on this side of the tracks, basically where Woodenhead Park and the McDonald's are now, for their station and yards, which would have made a lot of sense. But the railway refused to deal with Farwell and moved their station and yards up here. We'll talk about that when we get up to this part of this neighborhood. But this was the original Farwell town site. Some of the street names are still in place. We've got Front and Douglas Street, and King, Hanson, Benson, Wilson, and Wright. And but we also have John, James, and George, and they continued with those names for a while, and it was later changed to first, second, and third throughout the town. So the Farwell town site was basically everything in that little semicircle at the bottom of the hill. That was the original Farwell neighborhood. This picture was actually from taken from a photograph inside of a little glass paperweight. That's why it has the little corners on it and the little crack in it. It's actually from a paperweight. But you can see there, this was taken about 1890. That house is still there at the bottom of the hill. And you can see what's now I believe it's a yoga studio now. That was most people would remember as Needham's, building contractors. It started its life as a, come on in.
Excuse me.
Yeah. There's extra chairs here.
Thanks very much.
Grab them. So yeah, it started its life as a butcher store, the J.R. Hull Meat Market. And you can see a lot of the businesses down along Front Street there. So the Farwell this was the original business part of town. The first jail and provincial offices were down there. The fire department was formed in 1892, and they had the fire hall down there. There was a lot of the social life of the town was that's where it was started. Yeah, we'll get to that. This is a picture of Front Street around 1905, and it looks like they're actually having a horse race on there. They actually used to use sort of going around the circle in Front and Douglas for horse racing until they ended up with a proper racetrack. But I can't imagine that the business owners would be too happy. Look at all the dust the horses are kicking up there. And then Douglas Street was also part of the Farwell neighborhood. So this is the bottom of looking up the Douglas Street hill. That house is still there. That was the Revelstoke's first hospital, privately run hospital in 1897. It's now a private home. But the interesting thing you can see is there's actually a little bit of bridge work on Douglas Street at the time as well. So there was a little gully there. And I believe that was the blacksmith shop at the bottom of the hill.
Cathy,
Mm-hmm.
do you know if Farwell ever used to flood?
The big flood year in that time was 1894, and definitely it washed out some of the things right along the riverbank.
Right.
That was it didn't flood onto the street, but it flooded out some of the bank, and there was a lot of erosion on the riverbank then. That's why they, around the turn of the century, they built what's known as the Wing Dam. So at low water, you can see this stone structure coming out from Front Street. That was the Wing Dam, and it was built to divert the river from hitting the riverbank and continuing to erode it. So that was definitely a big problem back then. But yeah, I think the street itself wasn't completely flooded, but some of the bank was washed away. There was note about a chicken coop washing down the river with the chicken sitting on top of it. So, I don't know whether they managed to save the chicken or not, but this was most of Front Street was commercial, but this is on the south end of Front Street where the big apartment building is now. And it was the home of the Corsier family. They actually named their house Ballynahinch, which was a practice back then of naming your house. And they had a beautiful yard and gardens. You can see some fruit trees in there as well. The Corsiers were, Corsier was one of the early merchants on Front Street, and that was his family property. Also on Front Street was the original Chinatown. Revelstoke actually ended up with two Chinatown sections. The second one was around where the cabin is now, across from the city parking lot, that whole block. There were quite a few businesses there that were owned by Chinese merchants. So when the town itself shifted, the Chinatown shifted as well. But there was originally quite a concentration of Chinese merchants on Front Street, especially between King and Benson avenues, and there was some stores and laundries down there. They also had some businesses on Douglas Street as well, and this was their Chinese temple that opened on Front Street around 1900. And as I heard somebody whisper a while ago, also part of the business section of the lower part of town was the red light district. There were several brothels. You have the city police records going back to 1900 when Revelstoke had its own police force. And in 1 year, the year 1900, I counted the names of 50 different women who were arrested on charges of prostitution. They usually called it an infraction of bylaw 9, which was the bylaw respecting public morals and convenience. That's the same bylaw that also said that if you were doing any public bathing, you had to be covered from neck to knees, and that was men. So that was most of what they were charged under. Of those women who were brought in, some of them were identified as keepers, so there'd be like a brothel keeper and madam, and some were identified as inmates of the brothel. The keepers were charged up to, I think the largest fine I saw was $25, and they were generally being fined like 2 to 3 times a year. So there was quite a bit of money actually going into the city coffers from the brothels. This is one, we don't know exactly where this was located, but we know that there were brothels on both Front Street and Douglas Street. It's a beautifully decorated house. You can't see it really well in here, but the paintings on the wall are nudes, which you wouldn't normally see in your Church of England woman's drawing room as a general rule. Several musical instruments on the wall as well. That was definitely part of the lower town. I'm not formally aware of there being any red light activity outside of Farwell, although I have heard rumblings about possibly in the Italian sector as well, but don't have any proof of that. But we definitely know that most of the red light activity was definitely down in the Farwell neighborhood. By the 1920s, there was really nothing left of the business district on Front Street. It had all shifted up here, and so all of the big hotels were gone by then. There were a few houses remaining, but then by, I think it was the 1930s, there was a mill built on Front Street, and the McGinnis family took it over sometime in the 1930s.
No, 1944.
44? Okay. And there was this was a fire at the mill in 1959. So that whole area just became industrial for quite a while. And then after the mill was no longer there, it converted back to a residential neighborhood. So there's no businesses left on Front Street. It's all completely residential now. This is a picture taken about in the 1960s, looking on Douglas Street from Benson. You can see it's evolved into a residential area. This is the Revel Inn. The building is still there. It was a little convenience store for quite a few years. I'm not sure the exact year that it was built, but it was still in operation in the late 70s, and maybe into the early 80s.
They made the best pies in town there.
Did they?
Yeah.
And the Farwell School was built for the neighborhood in 1959, and it closed in 1987. And that's now where the Okanagan College and Stepping Stones Daycare are located. And then Farwell Park was opened in 1962, and of course the Splash Park opened just this past summer in Farwell. But I think probably a lot of anybody who grew up here, who had kids growing up here, will remember the wading pool, and remember some of the very dangerous equipment like that sort of rocket ship slide that would sort of slice your legs and burn your legs. And there was a really, I don't think it was yet in this picture, but there was a couple of really dangerous roundabouts there too. I know my daughter and her friends used to love those because they were so dangerous. So So this is a town site that most people aren't aware of this name, but the community at that time was kind of defined by who was given tracts of land, and there was a tract of a land grant that was awarded to the Columbia and Kootenai Steam Navigation Company. And they were a company that started a lot of the steamboat service on the river and on the Arrow Lakes as well. And they were awarded a land grant of 26 acres that took in Kootenai, Wales, Wynn, and Ford Streets from Victoria Road to the Columbia River. So it was a fairly big chunk in that area. And John Andrew Mara, who is Mara Lake is named after, he was a well-known businessman from the Kamloops area. He was one of the partners in the Steam Navigation Company and held the property in his name. There was a community meeting held in August of 1893, and J.A. Mara was actually a member of Parliament at that time. And he was questioned as to why he had been able to purchase 26 acres within Revelstoke at the price of $5 per acre, when the going price at the time was $25 per acre. And he explained, he said Mr. Mayor rose and explained that he and others had formed a navigation company to open up Kootenai District by steamship communication. The company had 6 steamers on the river and lakes, and by this means they had done more for the town of Revelstoke than any other venture. He may have been forgetting about the CPR when he made that statement. Said after the steamers were built and ready for traffic, Mr. Mayor applied for the purchase of 26 acres of land. The price set upon it by the government was $5 per acre. He said this was all the company had ever received from the Dominion government, namely the privilege to buy the land at that price. But still the other people who were wanting to buy land were not impressed that they'd been basically given this land for next to nothing. But within that town site was the first courthouse. This was the original courthouse. It was basically on the same location as the current one, and it was built in 1897. And not quite as grand as our current one, but quite a beautiful building. You know, and you can see how tall it is. Look at the men standing there. Quite a big building with a big tower on it, and some quite nice architecture. But even by 1912, they decided that it wasn't big enough for the community, so it was removed, and they built the current courthouse. This is the Sibbald House across from the courthouse. So a lot of the businessmen of the day were building in that Mara Townsite in that area. It was some of the earliest sort of big houses were built in that region. This is the Taylor home, which is no longer there. So at the very end of 2nd Street, where there's a little apartment building there that was built by T.E.L. Taylor for his family, just at the crest of the hill right behind the Holton House. That was his brother's house right across from the courthouse, little bungalow built in 1902. Some quite pretty buildings. And this is some horse-drawn carts in front of the Taylor home. This house is no longer there, right on the corner, but also quite a pretty little house. So that was the second courthouse, built between 1912 and 1913, and of course our courthouse that's there now was built by the local firm of Pratolini and Foote, who are responsible for a lot of the heritage buildings that are still in town. There was a procession to the courthouse in 1912. You can see some of the other houses in the neighborhood. And of course the Holton House, this is a side view of it from an old glass negative. And that was built in 1897 for Charles Holton and his bride, Eliza.
You're hanging washing on the porch?
There's the laundry hanging on the line there. Even though they were upper class, they still had to do their laundry. So the Smelter Townsite, this is another one of those areas that was part of a land grant. The Kootenai Smelting and Trading Company was formed in 1899 with the intention of building a smelter in town, and they were awarded a grant of 320 acres that extended from Rokeby Avenue to Mackenzie, and from First Street to the Columbia River. The smelter was erected, and even by the time this picture was taken, which I believe is about 1899, the smelter was already gone, but it was built on land that stood about there. And because of the erosion on the riverbank, it eventually just fell right into the river. I've done the whole talks on the smelter, so I won't get into all the details of that. But as I say, the smelter company was granted land in this area. So street names like Rokeby, Orton, Boyle, Campbell, and MacArthur all come from names of the directors of the smelter company. So that's what all of these street names are as a part of that. And of course, this is Campbell Avenue, and it was, when they built the smelter, they built a spur track that came from the main line, following the side of Campbell Avenue all the way to what would have been the smelter, and then it branched down to the riverbank to the steamboat dock on the river as well. But there's another picture that shows a little bit later, because you can see the skating rink that was built in 1900. That was right where Coal River Manor Apartments is now. So all of this land would have been part of the Smelter Townsite. One of the big problems with the smelter was not being able to get sufficient quantities of ore to run the smelter on a regular basis, but also the Farwell dispute kept coming into play, because some of the land overlapped with Farwell's land, and until that whole mess was sorted, which wasn't until 1895, nobody could get clear title to their land. So the steamboat, or the smelter company, thought that they were going to finance their smelter operations by selling land in the town site, but because they because people couldn't get clear titles to their land, that kind of fell through. And people were building there, but nobody really had a clear deed until, actually not until 1897. The dispute between Farwell and the CPR continued in the courts until 1895, and then it took a couple more years for the gears to grind to be able to get all the paperwork done and actually give people title to their property. So that was kind of one of the reasons that the Smelter Townsite wasn't really successful.
Kathy?
Is that Eagle Pass that was between the two mountains?
Yes, that's Eagle Pass right there.
That smoke coming there, is that from that sawmill in the Big Eddy? I wouldn't be
It
surprised.
could be, yeah, because there was a sawmill
Yeah.
about where the truck stop is now in the Big Eddy, so that could well be from that. I hadn't noticed that before. This was a photograph of, I don't know if you remember the names.
Marilyn and Tessie Takahashi.
Okay. And so this was by the spur track that was built. So this would be close to, just across from where the community center is now?
Yeah. The building on the right is where the fire hall is now.
Okay.
That was the city electric generating station.
And this is right where we are right here. This was Boyle and First. So this, there'd been a house on this property previously that was moved when they chose this site for the post office. And the building wasn't constructed until 1926, but the lot had been cleared for quite a few years before that. And you can see across the street that was used to be trading post. There's nothing in there now, but there's where they just built the Tantrum.
Yeah.
Right in that little spot right there, and then Sharon Shook's house.
Yep.
And then next to it is now Kevin's Kitchen, but it hadn't been built at that point yet. So it was mostly residential at that time. This is the Harmony Lodge Apartments, which is now the hostel over on the corner. It was built in 1905 as the Knox Presbyterian Church. And then just the streets down across from from the hostel, and what's now the trading post was the red and white store. And meat markets down there. So that's all part of that area. So the downtown, what we kind of call the downtown neighborhood, was actually the CPR Townsite. So when the CPR made the decision to not deal with Farwell, they moved they acquired the land this side of, mostly originally the other side of Mackenzie Avenue, and they put their station and yards where they are now. And of course, the businesses wanted to be as close to the station as they could, so the businesses on Front Street started gradually moving up and establishing the downtown up here. So our downtown was developed as the result of a land dispute. You know, otherwise we'd probably all be, you know, doing our business down on Front Street still, and the station would probably be where the A&W is or was, and Woodenhead Park. So it completely shifted how the town developed. But once the CPR established their station up here, they had control of most of the land the other side of Mackenzie Avenue. So they started to sell lots in that area. So we've got the city tax records going back to 1900, and you can see there as people were acquiring their properties and building houses. So this picture was taken about 1899. You can see the McCarty house is there. Not a heck of a lot going on though on this side of Mackenzie Avenue yet. Not too many houses built. You can see the smoke there. That was from the sawmill, the Revelstoke sawmill, that was just on what would be now Victoria. Just if you continue on Victoria instead of turning at 4th Street, it'd be right in that area near the little apartment block in there. That was a big sawmill that operated for quite a while. So this is 1899. This is 1904, and you can see it starting to build up quite a bit more. And then this is 1912. So you can see how quickly it built up. The building there is Selkirk School, which was built in 1911 on that site. And there was a big dispute between the school board and the city and the citizens about, and the big question was, why are we building a school on the outskirts of town? Because at that time, it was the outskirts of town. There was not a lot around it yet at that point. One of the reasons they were building it there was because the city owned the land already. So it was cheaper for them to build there than to acquire another site. And that was there until 1983 when it was torn down and is now Selkirk Gardens apartments. But a lot of the houses that were being built in that area, there were there was one contractor in particular. His name was W.A. Foote, and he was also one of the partners with Pratolini that built the courthouse. They also built what's now the Taco Club and the bookstore and Manning's. And but before he was doing some of those bigger projects, he was buying up land on 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th Street. He'd buy the land, build the house, and sell the property, sell the house and the land. So he was responsible for a lot of those houses, especially between Mackenzie Avenue and Orton particularly, sort of in those blocks. And you can see some houses that are very similar in design. So he would take one block, like on 5th Street, there's a couple in a row that are very, very similar in design, and on 6th Street, there's some of those sort of more bigger square houses. So he would do sort of one design in one little pocket, and then do another design in another pocket. So that's where you see those pockets of very similar houses in that neighborhood. And originally the lots were 25 feet. So especially sort of in this block down here, that's when people were expecting the town to be very dense and with a really high population. So people were building their houses really close together. Once they started developing on Mackenzie Avenue, people were wanting larger lots. So people were buying 1.5 or 2 lots, and spacing them out a little bit more. So this is the residential area of 3rd Street, of Mackenzie Avenue from 3rd Street, and that's the McCarty house. He was Revelstoke's first mayor. They had their house built there in 1899. That's now a McCarty Bed and Breakfast. And Mackenzie Avenue was kind of that was the place to live if you wanted to if you were considered yourself kind of elite Revelstoke. You'd want to build on Mackenzie Avenue. So that's why you find some of the larger houses on that street.
I just noticed how much more snow there is, or ice on Begbie than there is now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what time of year that was taken either. Probably could be early spring by the
Yeah.
trees.
You see the Catholic Church spire?
Yeah, so that was the original Catholic Church. It was originally built where the Royal Bank is now, and it was moved there in 1899. And then on this side, there was a house that served as the manse, the priest's residence, and hall as well. And that one was replaced by the current church in 1964. And then they used the old church as the church hall, and tore that down in 1983 to build the hall that's there now. There's apparently some of the houses that were along some of the streets, 3rd and Street especially, 2nd, 3rd Street, were moved from Donald. And we don't know for sure which houses were moved, but I've heard that a lot from, especially just from word of mouth. This is a great photograph of Mackenzie Avenue around 1908, and you can see what was known most recently as Minto Manor was there. That was the home of Robert House, and they called it the Birches. Later became, for years, was a boarding house known as Birch Lodge. But you can see how the town is starting to be built up in that area. These are some houses on 3rd Street. These photographs were taken by Jessie Rutherford, Ruby Nobb's mother, around 1906, 1908. This house is no longer there. It was the Henderson house that most people would know it as, but it's an empty lot there now. That's Orton Avenue right there. And some of the other streets. Now these are some of the ones, one of these was Ruby's house. I think it was this one. And it was believed to have been brought from Golden. And it was possible that a lot of those others were as well, or sorry, not Golden, but Donald. Donald had been an early CPR divisional point, and when they moved they removed Donald as a divisional point and moved most of the services and the workers here to Revelstoke. So a lot of the people who had houses there, they just collapsed the houses, brought the lumber over here and rebuilt them. There's Mackenzie Avenue around 1921. There's a lot of, trees back on the street now, but the street was quite a bit narrower there then, and they had trees right out to the street. By the 1960s, those trees were very big, and there was a decision made to cut them down. It wasn't a universally popular decision. There's quite a brilliant letter to the editor written by Mrs. Denise Patrick complaining about cutting the trees down. But at least we do have trees back on the street now. And this is showing Mackenzie Avenue in the 1960s. And you can see there where they'd already made the move to remove some of the trees in this part of the street, but hadn't quite got to the back end of the street yet. And so at the far end of what we would consider the downtown area was what became known as Little Italy. So a lot of the Italian settlers that were coming were settling in the far end of 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Streets, close to Victoria Road, and then across in what's now South Side. And we'll get to South Side a little bit later. But this was the Gallicano Bakery that was, I believe it's now the sex shop at the end of 2nd Street. So we'll head up to Clearview now. The CPR Hill, they came up with the name Clearview for that property as early as 1909. There was a local business certificate that acquired a lot of the undeveloped land in that area and created this new subdivision. They were selling lots with a frontage of 50 feet and a depth of 120 feet, and started with an initial offering of 50 lots. So originally, behind the CPR station was this big hotel that was built by the CPR, and Hotel Revelstoke, and it operated from 1897 until the 1920s when it was finally torn down. And so this is a picture showing the lawn bowling green, and you can see some of the houses up on CPR Hill as well. This was not really on the hill, just at the base of the hill, but kind of across from Campbell Avenue. This was the home of Robert Tapping, and he called this place the Old Plantation. He was quite proud of his beautiful gardens. He was a bit of a character. I've done a whole talk just on him. I repeat that one again. He's a very interesting fellow. He is the one that started the Opera House in town, the first theater where they had motion pictures, and he also sold dynamite, and was on the city council, was a bit of a character, but as I said, he deserves his own talk, so we'll do that again one day. He purported to have the first apple tree in the North Kootenai district, but that was disputed by O.H. Allen, who also said he had the first one. This was a CPR employee who had his house up on the CPR Hill. This picture was taken about 1912. There were quite a few of the homes up there that were also reportedly moved here from Donald. On March 27th, 1959, there was a mudslide, and it took out a house, caused the house caught on fire. There were 4 people that died in that. There was an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Pletch, and a young woman, Mrs. Schutze, and her young son, who died in that. And the Schutzes, Mrs. Schutze and her son, had actually gone over to the Pletch house thinking that it would be safer when things started to move on the hill. But the Pletch house was hit altogether, and it caught on fire as well, so the 4 people died in that. There was some belief that it was caused by both the unstable ground, but also by some of the construction that was happening on the hill above for the Trans-Canada Highway. It's possible that some of these slides are reversed, so if they look like they are to you, let me know, because they were done from negatives, so we're not entirely sure that they're all the right way around. These were all taken just after the mudslide. You can see where it came down the hill there. And this is the house, the Dame house was built on the property just behind the original CPR hotel, and that one's still there. Is the one up on top, is the older house up there still?
They took it down right after that slide. They wouldn't let them live in it.
Okay.
Ricky Daniels.
Yeah, we have it identified as Daniels, or?
Daniels, yeah, actually some of the Rockford distiller in the woods there.
Oh, okay. Okay, now we'll move on to Columbia Park. Columbia Park is actually named after a park. This is showing, taken from up on Mount Revelstoke, showing the Columbia Park area and sort of the bend of the river around that point around 1962, because the Trans-Canada Highway Bridge is there. But that area was mostly farmland. But in May of 1899, the city was, it was a brand new city at that time. They were granted parkland from the Dominion government in that area, and later became you know, part of what's now the golf course. But that was parkland. They had community picnics there and celebrations. And then in 1908, they built a racetrack there, and they had their first fall fair in 1908. And they actually had the local steamboat, locally owned steamboat, the SS Revelstoke, taking people up to the fairgrounds for the first fall fair in 1908. That's some of the, not sure if that's the 1908 fair, but it was one of the fairs that was held, and you can see the fence for the race grounds. And then in 1911, they built this building for their agricultural hall, and it was built with a cupola on top so that they could judge the races from up there. And it's still in use as the golf club now. The land was turned into, it was transferred from the Fall Fair Society back to the city, and then the city granted it to the new golf club when they formed in 1924, and that's when they built the first 9 holes of the golf club, and it incorporated some of that original horse race land into it, the race course. This was a farm, the Jock Malcolm farm. It was on the current golf course land. It was later added into when they expanded the golf course, land was included into it. So there were quite a few farms in that area. Columbia Park was mostly farmland. And most of the street names that you'll see are related to some of the early farmers and settlers in that region. There's little townhouses there called Upper Place. It's not upper and lower, it's the Upper family. And this is Reg and Selma Upper in front of their house in Columbia Park around 1918. That house later burned down. It was quite a beautiful big home. And the Uppers had a farm. Quite a few of the people that were farming there, among other crops, were farming strawberries. Strawberries were actually one of the biggest cash crops in Revelstoke for quite a few years. This was the Peterson farm that's now owned by the Spearbrecker family. The house is still there. And it was originally built on Front Street as a community hall, and then he moved it over to his farmland in Columbia Park. The street name Mary Hansen Place is named after Peter Peterson's niece, who they came out from Denmark to live with their uncle and look after him, and they ended up taking over the farm. There's actually, you can't really read it there, but on this photograph, he actually wrote on there complaining about the trees. He said that these trees had a short lifespan. They were sacrificed as feed for the neighbors' animals. No law in the province to protect shade trees on roads. So he was also a bit of a character. This was the Smythe Farm, which is close to where the Chevron station is now, at the base of the hill. And it's a picture of some of the members of the Smythe Farm. This was the oldest daughter of the family, Marjorie Smythe, who later became Marjorie Kelly and then Marjorie Parker, and was well known in Revelstoke. A little bit farther up the Big Bend Road, there was quite a large orchard and greenhouse operation from the Maley family. They purchased land there in the 1890s and established big greenhouses and an orchard there. And there's Job Maley in his greenhouse around 1915. Let's see how I'm running out of time already, sorry. I knew this was going to happen. So Big Eddie also was mostly farmland in the early days. I think most people in this room know where the name comes from, but it actually comes from the River Eddy that is just that side of the bridge there. And it was noted by some of the early explorers as being a really fierce eddy, especially in high water, and it was something that they had kind of marked on their maps and were very cautious of, because it was considered, really dangerous for navigation. There was a sawmill built out there in about 1900, about where the truck stop is now, and it actually fronted onto right close to the railway, but backed in right down into the river, and they had a jack ladder where they could bring logs up from the river. But you can see there where it's mostly farmland in the area. This is a picture taken from, an aerial picture taken from above the Big Eddy around 1960. The Calder family had a big farm at the mouth of the Tum Tum or Tonkawattla River. It's the official name is Tonkawattla, but for some reason it was also called the Tum Tum locally, so people know it by both names. But they called their farm the Tonka Farm. He came here as a Presbyterian minister and then ended up running his farm there. You can see that quite a big farm operation, that big barn. This was taken in 1963. And then a lot of the Scandinavians families that were coming out were settling in the Big Eddy as well. This is Nels Nelson, our famous ski jumper, and his sister Elise on their farm at the Big Eddy. And a lot of, during the Second World War, a lot of families, if they were able to had independent means and could move into the interior on their own without being sent to camps, they were allowed to find places to live independently. And there were quite a few families that came to this region, but the city would not allow them to live within city limits. But at that time, the Big Eddy was not part of the city. It actually wasn't part of the city until 1981. So there were quite a few Japanese families that were living in the Big Eddy during the Second World War. This is one of the families that lived there. So Southside, again, was a lot of it was mostly farmland. That's where a lot of the Italian settlers were coming, and so this area kind of in here was what was known as Little Italy, where a lot of the Italian families were settling. And you can see the houses are fairly sparse originally. This is a photograph taken from Arrow Heights looking down into the Southside area. And there you can see some of the streets, Moss Street, which didn't go all the way through, Downey Street. This was the wedding of Christy and Caterina Berarducci in 1925. The Berarduccis were one of the really early Italian families to settle here. Mr. Berarducci, Christy, was actually born in Revelstoke in 1899. And this is probably on Downey Street where a lot of the families lived. And at that time, the Downey Street was the dividing line for the city. So this side of Downey Street was in the city and that side wasn't. This was an Italian family who had a fire in their home around 1914, the Lorienti family. So a lot of the Italian families were living in that area. A lot of them had small farms. This is the corner of 4th and Downey, which was where Mount Begbie School was built. And the Downey Street Sawmill was originally started by three partners or two partners, Victor Kamosi and Walter Shaleski in 1947. And then Samuel Linnick joined them in 1950 as a partner. And also part of what would be considered Southside, which is on the riverbank, was the big Standard Dairy Farm. And this house, when they had to shut down their farming operations when the dam was going through, they wanted to keep their farmhouse and at least one of their barns. So they actually barged them across the Yellow Silhouette River and up to where they are now on Nickel Road. So you can actually see that farmhouse at the top of Nickel Road in the hills, and one of the barns is there too at what's now Jake and Jay. There was also other farms there. This was the Potter Orchard, photograph taken by George Stocks around 1940. And where the Mark Kingsbury pedestrian bridge goes across now, there was once a traffic bridge and a railway bridge, because that was the road down south and the railway line down south to Arrowhead. Mount Begbie Elementary School was built in 1967 and closed in 2012. and was since torn down. And then Arrow Heights, this was the original road up to Arrow Heights. So there were two ways of getting to that area. There was the lower road, that was called the Loop Road, that followed the bridges across, and then there was the hill. And it was called Moran's Hill because the Moran family had a farm just at the base of the hill, around where Illicellewaet Road is now. And again, that was mostly farmland. This was the Lonzo family that established their farm there probably in about 1899. That A-frame barn was in place for quite a few years. It was not that long ago that it was torn down, in some of our memories anyway. It was built as part of a work bee back in 1916. So this is Airport Way, and Nickel Road would be just up in here. So then there's some large houses that's another subdivision, so there's some large houses being built in there now. The Hay family had a big farm in the area that's now Hay Road, so it's not named after a crop, it's named after the family. And they had quite a big farming operation there going back to the 1890s. This is quite a substantial farmhouse. Their daughter was getting married there in 1913. And this picture is from about 1970 or 1971, and this is where the hospital is now. And there's not much up there yet. You know, it was really after the 1970 that most of the current development happened. And of course, you can see the rebuilt airstrip that was rebuilt after they put the dam in. This was the Bailey farm at the south end of Williamson's Lake. So there was, as I say, that most of that land was farmland all through there. And of course, Williamson's Lake, which is still a popular spot, and anybody who grew up here long enough ago will still remember the diving tower. So that, you know, as I say, this is one of those topics I could go on forever. There's tons and tons of photos, but it's just kind of a snapshot of some of the different communities in the area. This week is Heritage Week, and on Saturday we always do a Heritage Day at the museum. So this year it's Saturday, February 22nd. We'll start with a downtown walking tour at 10 o'clock. So we'll just start at the museum and just do sort of a walk down into Grizzly Plaza and Mackenzie Avenue and back for about an hour. And then all day we'll have open house, free admission. You can look up the history of your heritage home or building. I've got a couple of volunteers who will be helping with that. And then I'll do a heritage slideshow at 3 o'clock. And then our next brown bag is on March 4th, and that's the 110th anniversary of the Rogers Pass 1910 March 4th snow slide, so we'll be talking about that subject then. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
I have one. Is there something that you would like to do in naming these areas so that the city and the new people know the names of these areas? We all mostly know, not to say that it's superfluous what you're saying, but for the new people and for historical reasons. Did you ever want to have some kind of I don't know if a map or downtown little signage that you ever thought about?
There was sort of the signage project that was done sort of on the Greenbelt. We've talked about maybe expanding that, and you know, there definitely should be some signs in Farwell, because most people coming into the community have no idea that was where the town started and that was the downtown. So yeah, it's not a bad idea to do something like that to mark those areas. Yeah. It isn't mentioned in my latest book, but not everybody's read my book.
Yeah.
It's not a bad idea to have some way to mark those.
Cathy, as part of the wayfinding strategy that the city approved last week, there are some neighbourhood signs incorporated. So if it's down the line, the next kind of plan is to roll that over kind of 6 years, but there are plans to have signs for neighbourhoods in that strategy.
Good. Yeah. when I said in my book, everybody, you know, has, they kind of know what neighborhood they live in, especially ones, you know, South Side and Big Eddy, and people are quite passionate about their neighborhoods. In the book, I talked about where we were having a book sale one day, and we had probably about, you know, several hundred books out, which is just a drop in the bucket of our book collection that we're trying to weed out. But somebody came by and said, "Oh, I didn't know people in Southside read books." So Southside always had kind of, you know, little lower class vibe to it, but you know, we've been in that neighborhood now for 39 years, and our daughter went to Mount Bigby School. And, you know, it changes a neighborhood when you lose your school, you know, and because there were a lot of Italian families there, that school in a way, especially in its early days, was kind of, you know, kind of a focal point for the Italian community too.
I just wondered too, and you probably know, is how the native history dovetailed into the early settlers and why things developed in certain areas. And I just kind of feel like we're all haunted by ghosts that were denied, and it would be really cool to show more how it dovetailed into the early.
Yeah, I think Laura Stovall deals with that in more depth in her new book, Swift River. We don't, other than you know, the village sites in the Big Eddy, we don't have a lot of stories about how they were using the land. We know that, you know, definitely we know that they were here. There was a village site in what's now Big Eddy. But by the time of settlement here, they were already quite displaced, still trying to access their land. This is mostly the Sinaiaks people. So they were still trying to access their land, and they were being told that they had no right here. They were American Indians is how they were referred to. So there's not lots of stories about the very early days, but most of the stories involve conflict and definitely a lack of understanding of the indigenous use of the area. Well, thank you, everybody.